Good morning, church. How are you guys doing today? Awesome. I tell you what, July 25th, 2021, Pastor Brian realized he was old. I realized that a long time ago, guys. He's a late learner. No, I'm just kidding. I got to tell you, I love being part of this church. The camaraderie that we have here, the community of this church is such a beautiful environment to get to serve God together in, to get to be part of. Pastor Brian, Pastor Robert, they're a blast to be around. Well, guys, my name's Foster. If I haven't had the chance to meet you yet, if you're new to our church, thanks for hanging out with us this week. I'm very excited. We are actually concluding this series on old school. I feel like it's been going on for quite a while, right? But it's been good. It's been good. These characters that we're looking at, their traits, what we're learning about them has been really inspiring for me as I've gone through the text, as I've sat in the audience and listened to the messages as well. There's just been a lot in here. And so we're going to wrap up today. We are looking at a woman by the name of Esther. Esther is our final character study for this series. Esther has a really neat story. And again, everything that we're doing with this series comes out of the book of Hebrews. And so in Hebrews chapter 12, the author of Hebrews writes this book, and he's inspiring the Jews of his day. And specifically when we get to Hebrews 11 and 12, he's listing out these individuals from throughout history who have fought for their faith time and time again. And he's using them as kind of like pillars and examples, like look to these people. And this is what he says after going through this list of individuals. He says, therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. Now, he's not literally talking about a foot race here. He is talking about the race of life, reaching the finish line in life where we can stand before God. And as Paul so often said, that I might stand there and hear, well done, good and faithful servant. You ran the race well. You accomplished the task. You persevered to the end of it. The author of Hebrews is telling us the same thing. Life is difficult. The challenges are insurmountable. There is a lot that you have to go through, but look to the people who have gone before you, who have finished the race well, this cloud of witnesses, and run with endurance like them the race that is before you. And we've looked at giant pillars of the faith, Moses, Abraham, Jacob, David. We've looked at Ruth, Jonah. And so today we're concluding with Esther. And kids, I know that Pastor Brian gave you the word for the day. What is the word for the day? Wisdom, that's right. So you can check that one off right there again, wisdom. And wisdom is a funny word. We don't always use it that much. It almost sounds like an older word, but wisdom is a beautiful word. And we're going to see from Esther that wisdom plays a heavy role in our life, especially when it's used correctly. So I looked up just to see, what would we call wisdom nowadays? This is what the dictionary says. Wisdom is the soundness, of an action or decision with regard to the application of experience, knowledge, and good judgment. So wisdom is saying that we make a good decision, a good action based on three things: experience, what we've already been through; knowledge, what we've learned; and good judgment, common sense. Being able to look at a problem and decide, what would be the best course of action today? When we can make a decision with all three of these things added in, and it's a good decision, it's called a wise decision, or wisdom has been in play in that. And we see that in Scripture, wisdom is actually very important. Jesus himself commands us to be wise. We see in the book of Matthew, he is instructing his disciples as they're going out into the world, the things that they're going to face. And he tells them this, he says, behold, I'm sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. So be as wise as serpents and innocent as doves. And it can surprise us sometimes reading this passage right here because serpents are typically not heralded in the Bible. Typically, serpent is used to symbolize Satan or the enemy or sin or evil. And yet right here, Jesus makes a statement. He acknowledges that the serpent, even the original serpent, was shrewd. If we go and look at how the enemy deceived Adam and Eve, he was very shrewd in how he went about it. He was very, very clever. And Jesus is saying, as you go, you should be innocent as doves, but be wise and shrewd as a serpent. Think things through. Now, he's not telling us to act like Satan. I want to make very clear on that, He's not telling us to sin, but he is saying that as you go through life, you should approach every situation that you have with a level of wisdom and shrewdness. Don't rush into these decisions. Don't blindly charge in. Think these things through. Now, I think that wisdom is one of the great filters of life. In my very few years, as I've grown and learned and made bad decisions and learned from that, I've realized that wisdom is kind of one of those things that the bad things in life, the early thoughts I have as a teenager kind of get caught by it. They don't pass through, thankfully. I can actually remember being 17. I wasn't aware of this until a couple years ago, but I remember being 17 and actually thinking these thoughts, and this is depraved Foster right now, okay? But listening to my parents and adults in my life give me advice and thinking, you're a moron. Can't you see? How do you not see? I have this figured out. I know what life is. I know what I need to do. And now I work with teenagers, and so often I'll talk with them and we'll talk about life and situations, and I love teenagers, but I'll share my heart. Hey, I've walked where you're walking. I've been through what you're going through, and this kind of decision right here, this is the choice you want to make. And they'll look at me and go, nah. I'm like, oh, that's what it was like. This is what you're doing, Lord. You're giving me a taste of who I was. I understand it. They think I'm the moron. You little snot. No, I do love our teenagers. I do love our teenagers. But I actually remember that thought process. And I never said it to my parents because I believed in self-preservation. And I didn't say it to most adults because I grew up in the South and you were taught to respect. But I do actually remember thinking, how do so many of these adults not have this figured out? How have they made it through life without figuring these things out? And as I grew older and experienced different things, realized how faulty my thought process was, I was able to learn and hopefully become a little wiser and understand that there was so much more than just what my 17 years of experience had taught me. Wisdom is on display in the book of Esther from the opening words all the way to the very end. The story of Esther is incredible. It's a beautiful story. It's a huge part in Jewish history. Fun trivia fact, Esther is actually the only book of the Bible in which God is not a character. He's not mentioned once within the book at all. And actually, when they were putting together the canon of Scripture, it made them pause, and they asked, should we actually include this? Because God's not listed in here. But what we see is that all throughout the story of Esther, God is working within the background. A lot of the decisions that she makes, the interactions that she has with her uncle Mordecai, they're based on the belief that there is a God guiding history and guiding us and leading us. And for most of us, this book can become incredibly relatable that way because if we're being honest, in my life, it's very rare that I physically or mentally or emotionally or whatever experience the presence of God. Most times when I'm interacting with God, it's an understanding of my heart based on what he's taught me in Scripture. There is not a burning bush. There is not a cloud in the sky that looks like the Virgin Mary. Okay, there's not a pancake that looks like Paul. I'm like, that's where I need to go. Most of the time, it's a deeper understanding. And as we read through this, we see that Esther's commitment to following the Lord and doing what was right displays for us and gives us an example of how wisdom can be perceived in our lives. Now, the thing is, when wisdom comes into play, it can make us make decisions that a lot of times are contrary to what our culture would say is a good decision. And that's specifically what we're going to look at today. So if you have your Bibles, we'll go ahead and open up to the book of Esther. I'm going to run through just kind of the background of this, and we're going to dive in and see what Esther did with her uncle. And so this book takes place. The Jews have been in exile as slaves, basically, for a number of years. King Nebuchadnezzar came in. He conquered the northern tribes of Israel, and he finally the Assyrians conquered the northern tribes of Israel, led them away into slavery. Years later, King Nebuchadnezzar comes with the Babylonian Empire, the greatest empire of that time, and he conquers the southern tribes of Judah and Benjamin, and he leads them into exile. And the Jews, so far as history is concerned, are no more. Now, as time goes on, Babylon is overthrown by the Persian and Median Empire, and we get this man by the name of Cyrus, Emperor Cyrus. And Cyrus makes this decree, and he says, many of the conquered peoples that we've absorbed, you're free to return to your own countries. Now, we look at this and we think, well, that's kind of a dumb decision. Why would any emperor do that? Because it's good for the economy. He's releasing people to their homelands because this land has sat there. No one's tilling the ground. There's no crops. There's no revenue coming in. The people are oppressed. They're unhappy. He understands as a good leader that if we're going to do the most that we can and get the most money we can, people should be happy. If people are happy, they'll pay taxes more willingly. They'll contribute to our country more willingly. And so Cyrus has this idea, and he creates this edict, and he allows many, not just the Jews, but many of these slaves return to their homeland. And so we have the priest Ezra. He takes the first group of Jews back to Jerusalem. We learn a little bit more about that in Nehemiah's story. And this is where the story of Esther takes place. So the Jews have been released to return home, but we find here in Esther, many of them stayed in Persia. The reason for that would have been mostly financial. Okay? Traveling through the world at that point was not safe. It was not feasible. It was not always the wisest option. Many of these slaves would have actually had jobs where they made an income. Some of them would have been what we considered indentured servants, but many of them had a life in Persia. And so a number of Jews decided to stay, especially within the capital here in Persia, and they're continuing to work and they're continuing to be slaves. And this is where we pick up with Esther. Esther and her uncle Mordecai have remained in Persia. They've been there for a number of years. Cyrus is gone. There's a new emperor here, and his name is Ahasuerus. And Ahasuerus, we find out at the beginning of this takes place, if you know any history about Greece, the Battle of Thermopylae, those famous battles between Persia and the Greeks. This is that time period. Ahasuerus, also known as King Artaxerxes, is that king, okay? And so right now, Ahasuerus is celebrating his military exploits, and he's throwing the biggest party that Persia has ever seen. It says it literally went on for 180 days. For half a year, they throw a party to celebrate. A lot of wisdom in that right there. Parents, if you've ever had to throw a party for your kids, 3 hours in, you're like, we're done. This is it. Imagine throwing a 5-year-old birthday party for 180 days. Oh my goodness. But that's what's happening. They're throwing this party, and it's for everyone. That's the neat thing. The party is so extravagant that he actually proclaims this law that all of Persia should participate however they want. He says there's no obligation. You don't have to party like we party, but you're going to party, and you're going to have a good time, and you're going to celebrate. Now, King Ahasuerus, in the midst of this, we find out that he is having a great time, and he wants to continue to impress his friends and have an even better time. And so he has a wife, Queen Vashti. More than likely, he would have had a number of concubines, but he has one who is the queen who stands above all the other women in the palace, Queen Vashti. And we find out that Queen Vashti was actually throwing a party for the women at the same time. Back then, men and women a lot of times did separate things. And so the king has all his buddies are throwing their party, and Queen Vashti invites all the women in the palace and throws her party. And so King Ahasuerus invites Queen Vashti into the main throne room, and we don't know exactly what he intended, but he was going to parade her before the people gathered there. Whether that was to show off her beauty or to have her do something, we have no idea, but for some reason, Queen Vashti says no to the most powerful man in the world. And we can imagine how that goes. King Ahasuerus is in a rage about it, and he gets some of his buddies, and he's like, what should we do? And they say, well, this is going to cause problems for the whole kingdom because all the women are going to realize they can stand up to us. We can't have them realize that. And so they say, what you need to do is pass a law stating, one, deposing Queen Vashti, exile her from the palace. She's no longer queen, and reinforcing that all the men throughout Persia have ultimate authority in their houses. So Ahasuerus says, let's go ahead, let's do that. He makes the law. Vashti is removed from power, and this is where our story starts, with a young Jewish slave girl named Esther. Because you see, as time would go on, Ahasuerus, like any male, is suddenly all of a sudden very lonely because his queen is not there. And so he realizes maybe that was not the best course of action. Maybe I didn't display the best wisdom in exiling my wife because I was angry at her. And I don't know, I'm not married, so I can't vouch for this. I can't see that going well for any gentleman to say, you're banished from the house. I think those would be famous last words. And so Ahasuerus throws this big gala to try and invite all the women within the country to come and apply to be his wife. And it's a year-long process. And so what he does is he gathers all the young women that he can, Esther being one of them, even though she's a slave. He pulls her in, and she goes through this year-long beautification process. I'm not making this up. That's what it's called, a year-long beautification process. And that sounds highly offensive, but not a Persian. So she goes in there. And the neat thing that we learn about Esther, through her actions, we see that wisdom caused her and made her willing to do a number of things that seem counterintuitive for her self-preservation and her advancement. And the first thing that we see is Esther's willingness to remain discreet. Now, especially in our day and age, your pedigree and your reputation are very important. I think that's why when we have resumes and applications for everything, it says specifically on there, list any accomplishments you have relevant to this. You are bragging on yourself. Well, I've done this, 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 and this. That's why you should hire me. That's why you should give me that raise. That's why you should do X, Y, Z with me. I want you to know how great I've done. But when we follow Esther at the beginning of her story, as she is coming into this story, we see this in chapter 2. As she's brought into the palace, it says this, chapter 2, verse 10, Esther had not made known her people or her kindred, for Mordecai, her uncle, had commanded her not to make it known. So as Esther comes to the palace, and she's basically applying to be queen, and she's going through this beautification process, Mordecai instructs her, don't let anybody know that you're a Jew. Now, realistically, back then, they probably would have known that she was a Jew. Just like we can identify cultures from all over. When you visit anywhere in the world and you can see the people group there, and you can see there are certain things about that people group that tie them together. Persians and Jews were very different. So as soon as Esther comes in, especially to a place like the court of the king where he has scholars, they would have known most likely that she was a Jew, but she's not advertising her heritage here. Now, we don't know exactly why. We don't know if this was a wise choice to try and prevent her from being harmed. Most likely that was not the case, as she was again brought there personally by the king to apply to be his wife. But Mordecai is instructed her, hey, you need to almost be unknown in the palace. Now, Esther is competing against a number of women all throughout the Persian Empire at this point to try and get this role as queen. You would think she would do anything she can to stand out and make herself known, and yet we see here that she is making the wise choice to be discreet and to remain a little anonymous. And I think the reason for that is anytime we share our story, there are two things that come into play, either pride or pity. Pride in the sense of, I want you to know the great things that I've done, or pity, I want you to know the great things done against me and feel sorry and understand the pain that I've been through. And both of these things, neither one of them is bad in itself. Pride can be a good thing. Being prideful, not so much. Being proud, that's awesome. Pity is a helpful thing in a human society, but it can go too far. When I was living in Georgia, we did camps for teenagers, and every summer you get a bunch of college students from across the globe, basically. We would get students from Wales, from Alabama. I mean, that's about as far apart as you can get culturally right there. And so they would come together, and you get to know each other, and you don't have much time to get to know one another. You've got about a week. And so what we would do is throughout that first week, we would share testimonies. And it was funny. I remember thinking back to my first year. We sat down, we had testimonies, and our staff supervisor, Kale, was like, okay, here's what I want you to do. I want you to share your testimony. It needs to be about 2 minutes, okay? Because there's about 22 of y'all. So 2 minutes apiece means we're sitting here for 45 minutes to hear your story, okay? Solid. I can do that. So the first person shares. Kale's like, all right, it's not bad. You're about 3.5 minutes. That was really good. Cool. The next person shares. He's like, okay, you're about 5 minutes. The third person shares, they're at about 8.5 minutes. And at this point, Kale just stopped counting, and it went on. It took us about 4 nights to get through 20 people to share their testimonies. And what you ended up having was, as we're listening to each other's stories, you have this beautiful human connection where you're like, oh, I can relate to that. My dog died when I was 14 too. That's how I came to know Jesus. Oh yeah, I've got a sister that's just like that, possessed by Satan herself. That's why I came here this summer, to serve the Lord and get away from that spawn. But what actually was happening was, as these testimonies were being shared, the stories got bigger and bigger. There were more details that were included. And it was like, well, my testimony starts when I was 4.5 years old, and my big brother stole my fire truck. Like, what? What does that have to do with you and Jesus? But what we were doing was we were sharing more and more of these details. We're like, I want you to see the things I've overcome in my testimony. That's beautiful. Or I want you to see the things that have been difficult for me in my testimony and understand me more. And I think it's a human condition. We want people to know that. We want people to know the good things that we've done, how we've excelled, how we've accomplished things. And we also want people to understand where we're coming from. The difficult things that we face in life, they do help to shape us. And so I think there is this willingness to share things, and it comes down to, I'm proud, or I want you to know my pain. And yet Esther is told here, don't do it. Esther, don't share where you're from. Don't let them know that you've overcome slavery, that you've survived in a foreign culture all this time. Don't let them know that. Don't let them know that you were taken from your family, that your mother and father died when you were a young girl. Don't let them know that. They don't need to know your heritage and your people. And so Esther loses both of those footstools, the footstool of being proud of her heritage and the footstool of people understanding the pain she's been through. And she's left right in anonymity in the middle. And we see that she's willing to do this, which is an odd thing to do, but it's incredibly wise, because that discretion, that willingness to remain right there in the middle, meant that God was more able to work through Esther. Not because her being proud of her heritage or being sad from her heritage was a bad thing, but because it helped her focus on God and less on her own story. She wasn't riding the coattails of who she was. So we keep seeing, we go on, Esther ends up going to the capital. She goes through the beautification process. And at the very end of the beautification process, she would go before King Ahasuerus. And she was allowed, like any girl, to bring one thing with her that she wanted. That was it. You're given a choice. You can pick whatever you want, bring it. That's the thing you present to the king. Now, Esther, again, makes a very wise decision. We see this is the second thing that we're noticing about Esther, is her willingness to seek counsel. So we see this in Esther chapter 2. We keep going. When the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his own daughter to go into the king, she asked for nothing except what Hegai, the king's eunuch, who had charge of the women, advised. And so all the women, when it's their turn, are able to display basically their intuition, okay, their skill, their personality, and pick one thing to go before her. What Esther does, though, is she goes to the one person who would know the king better than anyone else in the palace, the king's chief eunuch, his number one servant. And she says, what should I take? That's a bold move, okay? Because Esther's probably going to learn something very, very good. But the downside is this. Esther is now giving up the chance to show that she is competent in picking something for her king. And that could set her behind. But what we see happen is actually it was a good decision. That verse continues, says this, now Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her. That willingness to humble herself, step back, and seek counsel actually causes her to gain favor. I teach for a homeschool cohort out in Winter Garden. And I have this discussion with them start of every class, the start of the year. And I tell them, guys, I want you to know something. I know that you've been told that there are no dumb questions. There are dumb questions. There are very dumb questions. And some of them, they're like, oh, how dare you? I'm like, just bear with me, okay? You'll understand. And I look at them and say, any question that is a genuine question, even if you should have learned it when you were 5 years old, is not a dumb question. If you're being serious about it, not a dumb question. Any question that is not genuine, okay? You're trying to be funny, you're trying to cause a scene, you're trying to highlight something, that's a dumb question because you're wasting time. But what I found was this, is even understanding that, okay? And even in culture where it's taught that there are no dumb questions, many of us are not willing to ask questions because we don't want to look dumb. I grew up being told, Foster, there's no dumb questions, okay? And I can count numbers and numbers of times where we would sit there in class and me or someone I knew would not ask the question. There might not be dumb questions, but there are certainly dumb people, and I'm not going to be one of them. That was the thought process. I remember being in elementary school, and we were going, I still remember this day, we were going through this in Miss Cole's third grade class, and with something to do with math, and my buddy Chris was sitting next to me, and I could see his paper, and he got this problem wrong, and she's kind of walking through how to solve this, and I can see on his face he doesn't understand it. And she goes, does anybody have questions? Anyone not understand it? And he just sits there. And I knew it. I understood. I was like, I wouldn't want to ask either because you're going to look like, why don't you know that? And this fear of looking bad prevented him from making the wise choice to seek counsel. And I think so often in life, we see that this fear comes in because, one, we want to show that we are competent and we're capable, that I can make these decisions. But there's a time and a place to seek counsel, and many times it's good. And we see that Esther shows us that. Her willingness to seek this counsel, even though she was showing, hey, I don't have all the answers, was a good thing. It was helping her to grow faster than any of the other women because we see that her, more than anyone else, she was the one who got the favor because she made the wise choice to ask. Now, as the story goes on, okay, we see this third piece, and that's Esther's willingness to pursue opportunity. Esther's willingness to pursue opportunity. Now, a lot of us have probably heard the maxim, you need to create your own opportunity, create your moments, seize the day. But Esther shows us something very different as we look at how she handles this situation. So as the story goes on, Esther is selected. She becomes the new queen of Persia. And very quickly, through a series of odd events, her uncle is kind of brought up as well. He's heralded before the king for basically stopping an assassination plot against the empire. And so there's another man within the empire. His name is Haman, who doesn't like Mordecai because every time that Haman, he's kind of an official within the empire. Every time Haman would go through the village gate, the empire's gates, the people would bow to him. They would recognize him. But Mordecai, Esther's uncle, refused to bow down to him. And so Haman kind of develops this anger and bitterness towards all the Jewish people. And he goes before the king because he knows the king. And he basically says, King, we need to stop this. These Jews are causing problems in your empire. What if we did this? Hear me out, king. What if we made a day where everyone within the Persian Empire can attack any Jew they want? That's literally what he says. Anyone can take up swords and strike down the Jewish individuals. And King Ahasuerus is like, I trust you, Haman. Let's go ahead and do that. And so he makes this law. And the interesting thing about Persian culture was when a king set forth a royal edict or law, it could not be undone. The king couldn't suddenly decide, you know what, scratch that, we're not going to make that law. Once a royal edict was established, there was no way to undo it. The king himself could not undo this law. The only way around it was to make side laws that somehow circumvented it. And so Haman has got this ploy going. He's going to destroy all the Jews. Now remember, the king does not know that Esther is a Jew. She has kept that. She's been discreet. She's held it close to her this whole time. And we see that Esther realizes she must do something about this. And rather than rushing in, because we think that the queen could do whatever she wants and just go before the king and say, babe, you messed up. There's a problem. I'm Jewish. Oops. But we see the way she acts is actually very interesting because she doesn't go in and demand and create her opportunity. Rather, she pursues the proper opportunity to act. This is how the story goes in chapter 5. Esther comes before the king, and Esther said, if it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to a feast that I have prepared for the king. She invites him to dinner. Now, any guy's like, absolutely, I'll take you up on that. But that was her way of getting in with the king. Because you see, before this even happens, Esther has to go before the king. And in Persian culture, unless the king summoned you directly, you could be executed on the spot. Anybody, including the queen. And so when Mordecai finds out the Jews are going to be executed and he comes to Esther and says, you need to do this, she says, I haven't been summoned, and if I go, I might die. And Mordecai looks at her and goes, if you don't do this, you will suffer just as well. And you don't know, maybe you've come to be queen just for such a moment as this. Maybe this is the reason that God brought you there. And we see that Esther, again, rather than rushing in and creating her opportunity, says, all right, do this with me. Ask everyone that you know of our people to fast with me for 3 days. You see, Esther was seeking the opportunity that God was going to lay out. She was looking for the exact time where God was like, this is the moment, Esther, that I want to work, that I've been preparing you for. And so Esther takes that time, and her decision, the wisdom, displayed itself in her by going before the king, and rather than demanding, king, this is what we need to do. And we look at this story, and we're like, well, why wouldn't Esther go before the king and just say, king, he's betrayed you, he's lied to you, I'm a Jew, he's attacking my people? Because the king had made that law. And if Esther had gone into the royal throne room, see, what we don't see in the story here is in a Persian throne room, you would have had the king, you would have had his chief eunuch, you would have had about a dozen guards, you probably would have had about a dozen to 24 officials all there to serve the king. And had Esther walked and been like, king, the law that you made was a mistake, we can almost be guaranteed that Ahasuerus would have been angry more than he was willing to listen. Esther, in her wisdom, sought the proper opportunity and said, you know what, I bet I can get him alone so I don't embarrass him. King, I'm going to throw a feast for you and that guy over there. Haman, why don't you two come and let me cook for you? And so they come, they feast. The king asks Esther again, what can I do for you? And she says, if I found favor in your sight, king, and if it pleases you to grant my wish and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come to the feast. I'll prepare again tomorrow. She's buttering him up real good right here. And then I'll do as the king has said. When I worked at Chick-fil-A, I had two different kinds of employees, co-workers that I'd always get to work. It's always cycled through. We would get guys in there and girls, and there's no perfect organization. This church is not perfect. There's no church on earth that is perfect. There's no business that's perfect. They're all flawed because we're all flawed human beings. And so there's always something that can be done better. And we would get crew members in there that would see what was wrong, and they'd get frustrated by it, and they'd have one of two responses. And it was always interesting to watch this, both when I was an employee and in management. Some of our co-workers would say, this is wrong. I can't stand this. I'm going to quit. I'm going to teach them a lesson. I'm leaving here. They're not going to get me. And then they're going to learn what's wrong. And they would go in and they would create their own opportunity as they were supposed to clock and be like, no, I actually quit. Now you're shorthanded tonight. And now you're going to realize this needs to change. And it never changed. All that would happen is 9 times out of 10, that person would come back at the end of the month. Hey, can I get a job back? But we also had crew members. And I remember when I first got hired there, I had a trainer who did this. And he noticed, he would constantly tell me, like, yeah, Foster, I see this happening within our culture, and I just don't think it's right. And I would watch him work his butt off for months and months and months and months and months and get moved up in different roles and positions and titles until he was finally in a leadership role. And then he would say, oh, by the way, because then he had an audience with Rocky. I've noticed this thing working here that's not healthy. I think I have a way that we can change this. And there were two different people there. There was someone who tried to create the moment. I'm frustrated. I'm going to make the moment right now to fix it. And then there was someone who pursued the opportunity, like Esther, who said that there is a time and a place for me to do this. And if I wait, I can find that opportune moment and get the chance to speak before whoever's in charge and change what needs to be changed. And we see that same thing with Esther. Rather than rush into the throne room and demand, I am the queen, it's what you need to do, she pursues the opportunity. She goes before the king. And we see this how the story ends in Esther 9. On the very day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain mastery over them, the reverse occurred. The Jews gained mastery over those who hated them because Esther has a way for the king to actually have another law that allows the Jews to defend themselves. And what we see throughout all of this is what I want you to take away from today, is that wisdom is finding the balance between what is good for us and what is greater than us. You see, there are things in life that are good for us. Your pedigree, your resume, your reputation is good. Your story is good. The things you've overcome, the things you've faced have shaped you, those are good. Pursuing opportunities, taking initiative, that is good. Seeking your safety and your security and that of your family is good, but there's a time and a place where something far greater must supersede it. And wisdom is what helps us understand that balance. That sometimes I have to give up what is good for me and seems good for me and culture says is good for me in order to pursue something that is greater. Because Esther risked her life throughout this whole thing. There's a man by the name of Jim Elliott. Some of you may know Jim Elliott's story. His story is very, very famous. He was a missionary to the Ecuadorian people back in the 50s. Jim Elliott was a graduate of Wheaton College. He went there. He was, I believe, studying engineering, but he was a passionate Christian. Everyone who came into contact with Jim Elliott, that was the one thing they would say is Jim Elliott is in love with the Lord, and he was very devout and steadfast in what he believed. He would give up opportunities to do things that were good, that would give him prestige in college because he believed as a Christian, he was not called to do that. As a Christian, he was not called to get involved in certain affairs. As a Christian, he was not called to give certain speeches. Jim Elliott continued to grow up, and he had a passion to bring the gospel to completely unreached people groups. I'm not talking about areas where the church is kind of stagnant and small. I mean areas where they've never heard the name of Jesus Christ before. And he heard about a people group in Ecuador named the Auca. And he believed that he was called by God to go and bring the gospel to the Auca people. And so he prepares and he trains for years. And on February 12th, 1952, he arrived in Ecuador for the first time. And he began by evangelizing to another group of people who had heard the gospel very faintly. And he started helping them learn more. And through that, he learned some of the dialects that area of Ecuador. And he asked them, he goes, I know there's a people group here, the Huaharani, known as the Auca. And he goes, I want to get involved with them. They warned him, we call them the Auca. Auca in our language means savage. They're very violent. They don't trade with outside people groups. They don't deal with anybody. That's a very dangerous idea. And he believed, I believe God is calling me to the Huaharani people. So 1956, 4 years later, Jim Elliott, for the first time, makes contact with the Auca tribe. Him and four of his friends, they charter a plane and they flew over this area of Ecuador, and they were able to kind of spot part of the village, and they would lower down baskets of gifts and supplies. And they had a loudspeaker and they would talk to them. They had learned a little bit of their dialect. They didn't have a written language. And they're able to actually kind of make contact, and for a couple of days, they would land, they set up a base, and a couple of the Auca tribesmen would come to them, and they get to know them. They had a guy they got to know. They named him George. They didn't understand his real name. That was very clearly not the name of an Ecuadorian local, but they called him George, and they took him up in their plane to give him a ride. This is a man who had never seen technology. And as the days went on, they believed that they were advancing in their goal to bring the gospel to this part of Ecuador. And then on January 8th, 1956, a group of 10 Auca tribesmen walked into their little camp and killed all 5 men. Now, it does not seem like a lot of wisdom to go to a part of Ecuador that is uncharted, where there are people groups who want nothing to do with the outside world. Jim Elliott had a wife. He also had a daughter that had been born about a year before that. But what was interesting is Jim Elliott, in his journal years before, he wrote this down in his journal. He said, he is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain that which he cannot lose. You see, Jim Elliott understood that sometimes in life, to truly pursue the gospel and to have a life devoted to Christ, we must understand there's a balance that requires us sometimes to give up what is good for us to pursue what is greater than us. Safety and security, and please hear me on this. I'm not saying that safety and security are bad things. A good reputation is not a bad thing. They are all good things. Working hard is a good thing. Providing for your family is a good thing. But if that becomes God in our life, if the security of me and my family is God, then we've erred. I read an essay the other day by a man named Francis Schaeffer. one of the greatest theologians of the 20th century. And Francis Schaeffer wrote this essay. He called it Two Contents, Two Realities. And in it, he talked about the four things that are required for a genuine faith that could impact the world. He said your faith must have two contents to it, two actual aspects of your faith, and it must lead to two realities if it's going to be genuine. And I won't go into all the details, but one of the realities he said was this: there must be a spiritual reality. And what that means is this: he goes, we have to understand as Christians that this is not a book of fables and stories that give you some kind of moral guidance. That this is a story about a real living God with prescriptions and commandments that were very serious to be carried out. That the human condition has with it a soul, a spiritual aspect to it that is tied to our physical world, that things we do in our physical world impact the spirit. That one day we are really called to give an account. It's not just a story to help us live a good life. It's not some ethereal presence. It is one living God who right now is active. That's what it means for a spiritual reality. When we understand that this is reality and we try to live by it, that's when we get the wisdom to find that balance. That maybe sometimes I have to give up what's good for me to pursue what is greater than me. And that's what we learn from the story of Esther. You know, Jesus gave up a lot of good stuff for him. I can tell you what, coming to live on earth was not a good thing. Living in a place where people despised him, where he could step on a thorn, where he could get sick, those were not good things. Being betrayed by his friend was not a good thing. Being crucified is certainly not a good thing. Having his own father say, I can't bear to look at you because you're steeped in so much sin when he took sin on himself is not a good thing. But Jesus understood there was something greater, submitting to the Father. And the Father deeply cared about his creation. And Jesus said, if you care about it that much, you're my Father, it must be important. And Jesus submitted himself. He understood the balance of giving up what was good for him to pursue something that was greater than him, glorifying the Father. Now, I'm so excited to be part of this church. I'm so glad that you guys are here. We've loved getting to do this series. We love getting to do life with you guys. We're excited for God's leading this fall. I'll be down in front. Pastor Brian will be out in the foyer if you'd like to talk to us. I just want to pray us out, guys, and then we'll go ahead and conclude this week. Father, thank you so much for today. I thank you for loving us. I thank you for providing for us, for giving us the chance to come together, to dive into your word, to look at individuals who went before us, who held steadfast to their faith. I pray that you would give us wisdom, Lord, to understand and to find that balance, not to ignore the good things, the wise choices that we have before us, but Lord, to understand that those good things can never outweigh our pursuit of you. And that sometimes we have to give up the good things to pursue something that is greater than us, you and your name. Dear Lord, I pray that you be with everyone here, that anyone's going through a difficult time, you would be with them, that you bring healing and hope. And if that is not to come right now, that you'd at least bring friends and family around them so they do not have to go through it alone. Jesus, I love you so much, and I pray all these things in your name. Amen.